So just a little bit about Allnet Insights. We're a leading authority. We're not the leading authority, just a leading authority on wireless spectrum ownership. Our tools and reports provide detailed, comprehensive spectrum depth, spectrum assignment information, based licensed POPs, megahertz POPs, which is more of a pricing mechanism for the United States and Canada. What we ultimately do is we track through the FCC transactions process who owns each block of the spectrum, and in the US we track that all the way down to a county level. So you could see for this particular county all the spectrum assignments and who controls that spectrum. That ultimately drives to, well, how much does AT&T own in composite in this county, in Austin, in Houston. In Canada, it actually breaks down. They don't have counties. We break it down to a Tier 4 service area, which if you haven't dealt with the spectrum up there, it's kind of county-like boundaries. But that's just a little introduction into what we do. I noticed that several of our customers, our solutions are subscriptions to companies, and several of our customers are here. I don't know that if you're interested in our products, just reach out. You may already have a subscription and can immediately have access, but then also happy to share how our subscription process works with anybody who would see a value in it. So the important thing, a little bit of 101, what is spectrum? And this is actually my wife's definition when she tries to explain what I do, is I deal with the real estate in the air that carries data between your phone and a wireless carrier cell sites. Some of this will kind of reinforce some of the concepts that we've kind of walked through already today. For 5G, we've already talked about the concept that 5G will be all different types of spectrum. A lot of the focus has been down in this millimeter wave, but other people have highlighted that low-band spectrum can be used, mid-band spectrum. So to give you an idea a little bit of some advantages and disadvantages for the spectrum, low-band spectrum does provide kind of a large coverage area. 15-mile radiuses, that may still be kind of on the outside of what you would expect. It would require a higher tower, but it gives you that idea that it's very broad in what it can cover from one cell site. But it's relatively light capacity, and that's predominantly because the channel sizes, you may only be able to use 10 megahertz of spectrum is all that you'd be licensed for in that low-band spectrum. So that has a carrying capacity of data of only 150 megabytes per sector. Mid-band spectrum, and I'd put / high-band spectrum, you kind of have a trade-off of less coverage but more capacity. And what I really want to highlight and why I'm calling it mid-band and high-band is we shifted this last year from talking about Sprint spectrum, the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, and AT&T's WCS spectrum that's at 2.3 gigahertz, from being high-band spectrum to now mid-band spectrum is everything from 1 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz. I put that up there to really emphasize all mid-band spectrum is not the same. The characteristics of 2.5 not covering as well as PCS or AWS spectrum is still completely true. As you go to the other mid-band spectrum that's like CBRS, which is 3.5 gigahertz, you need to have 5 cell sites for every 3 cell sites, 5 cell sites for every 1 cell site for low-band spectrum at that frequency, where you only probably need to have 4 for the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. So that mid-band spectrum, as you start to get higher and higher and closer to 6, you need a lot more sites than you do when you're on the low side of the mid-band spectrum. So I wanted to make sure we emphasize that. Now, millimeter wave spectrum, you get to a very small coverage area. 300 meters, 900 feet, whether you want to do English or metric units. But you do have a very large capacity, and that's, again, because the channel sizes are much larger. Verizon, in their, we've talked about their neighborhood launch in Houston, and we can pick on Verizon because they're not here, at least to the best of my knowledge. Their plan down there is they're using a 400 megahertz channel. So that's enormous compared to what we've talked about in the low band spectrum, being a 10 megahertz channel. Just translates to a lot more data that you can pass. So what are the US carriers' 5G plans? AT&T is focused on 39 gigahertz, and they begun to discuss adding low band spectrum later, and I'll kind of describe what I think that means. I'm not sure if anybody from AT&T will have kind of more information. Verizon is exclusively focused on the 28 gigahertz. T-Mobile is 600 megahertz. Adding millimeter wave later, they do have some, but as you kind of see the details of T-Mobile's millimeter wave spectrum, I don't think that they're going to be planning to use effectively either the two bands as they stand today, and I'll explain why. And then Sprint has their 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, so you can kind of see that part of T-Mobile's strategy in buying Sprint is that Sprint does have excess 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, and that gives T-Mobile an ability to have 5G coverage with low band, and then to start increasing capacity by using one of the other bands. So to understand the 5G spectrum puzzle, we're going to kind of look at it from these four different aspects. We're going to first look at what spectrum does a carrier control, and that's going to be by looking at national averages for their ownership in each of the individual bands. How much population can they reach with that spectrum? And that'll be more clear when we actually show you one of the charts. How many of the top 20, top 50, top 100 cities can a carrier launch? And we're going to look at a market analysis module for that. And then what spectrum can be rapidly deployed? And that what we're already seeing with the 5G deployments is that people are steering away from reusing spectrum, refarming spectrum. They're looking to what new swaths of spectrum they can initially deploy, and then they'll begin to convert the spectrum or refarm it in the future. For the slides that I'm going to show, one of the ways that we've developed our tools is for you to do the analysis. You don't want to pay us as an analysis firm necessarily, but you have the ability using our tools to generate exactly the outputs that we'll be going through next. So looking at national averages for both low band and mid band spectrum, what this lists out are all the different spectrum bands, and they're organized. So here are the low band spectrum blocks, here are the mid band spectrum blocks, essentially all the way up. And what we've also included is the new spectrum bands that are being auctioned. This does not include millimeter wave spectrum, but we do have the CBRS spectrum and the C-band spectrum, and so you'll see this is the CBRS spectrum, and I have it in the FCC's control today. And then the CBRS spectrum, we show 70 megahertz. There's actually 100 megahertz that's going to be included in that band, but 30 megahertz of it's always going to be available for kind of that pseudo unlicensed use. And Ian had indicated PAL licenses is one of the terms that was from a previous presentation that related to that CBRS spectrum. So what data does this kind of outline for us? You can see, here's T-Mobile's 31 megahertz of 600 meg spectrum. So that's the resource that they're deploying today that's ultimately going to be part of their 5G strategy. But again, what this relates to is this is a national average. So it doesn't mean that they have 31 megahertz in Dallas and in Seattle and in each of the individual markets. That's important because that's going to be the actual channel size and the data capacity that they can offer in that market. This is an important slide to look at from the perspective of the Sprint T-Mobile merger, because one of the large arguments or concerns around the Sprint T-Mobile is the accumulation of too much spectrum. And you can see that if you were to add Sprint and T-Mobile, you're going to end up with, and the actual number is about 368 megahertz of spectrum in the control of that entity. Kind of seems unfair, seems like the FCC might not want to have that go forward until you bring together the larger picture that Sprint T-Mobile are talking about a portion of Sprint spectrum really being for 5G, which opens the equation So let's look at the spectrum that's also part of the 5G spectrum equation. And you can see that T-Mobile is sitting here with 79 megahertz of true 5G spectrum, where AT&T has 382 and Verizon has 1,200. So I think it's my opinion that when the FCC has to kind of look cross services, either they do the math and they say we're taking this much from Sprint for 5G and we're adding it here, but I think there's a very logical argument to say that I think that merger will go through from the spectrum holdings perspective. This slide also highlights the spectrum that's still going to be available from the FCC. The current auction is for this purple section. There's only 200 megahertz of that 324 that's actually up for the auction. The rest of it is still in a band, part of that band that's more for point to multi-point that is not part of the auction. So when we talk about each carrier's deployments, now we're wanting to see how much of the population, is it truly a nationwide service that they would be able to offer? This is a little bit messy, but for AT&T, their 700 megahertz spectrum, they obviously have the FirstNet spectrum, which is this line that at the very top, they're basically have nationwide spectrum. It's 322 million pops that they're licensed for using that particular channel. So it's my belief that that has to always have LTE for the public safety folks. So if I was to have to, if AT&T was going to convert spectrum, it would be the spectrum, the B and C channels, and you can see that they don't have nationwide spectrum holdings. They only have about 300 million on one and about 290 million. So they just acquired all the spectrum in South Dakota, so that's going to go up a little bit, but they have some other acquisitions if they want to have true nationwide spectrum in that band for their 5G deployment. This is quite a bit simpler. We had to go down to that level of detail to break out the 700 megahertz, but their 39 gigahertz, their millimeter wave spectrum, does reach nearly the 322 million. So that's very feasible from being able to cover the entire US or a majority of the US. Verizon, on the other hand, this is where they're putting all of their focus on millimeter wave spectrum. The LMDS, which is the 28 gigahertz, they only cover 75% of the US population, but this is the spectrum that's currently in auction, and it's my belief that Verizon's is wanting to walk away with all the major metropolitan areas. They probably won't reach the 322 million because the other participants in this band are the small regional carriers. And in this auction, this is the only millimeter wave spectrum auction that allows you to purchase only a county. So it's really set up ideally for rural carriers that want to be able to avoid major population centers where there might be a lot of competition, but get rural counties where they may do fiber to a location and then distribute from that location using fixed wireless. T-Mobile, again in the same view, T-Mobile is able to reach, with their 600 megahertz spectrum, the full US population. But it gets a little more dicey when we look at their millimeter wave spectrum auctions, that they have only cover 100 million with their 28 gigahertz, and then they only reach about 40 million with their 39 gigahertz. Based upon this, I believe that T-Mobile is probably going to want to trade out of those blocks. Specifically, what they own in this LMDS spectrum is a large part of the major markets that Verizon, the top 10 markets in the US. So very valuable spectrum from what Verizon wants to accumulate. And so I would foresee a trade of that spectrum to get 39 gigahertz. But I also think that T-Mobile is going to be very active in the 24 gigahertz auction because they have the ability to get all of the top markets and to get a nationwide foothold. Sprint, they have virtually nationwide 2.5 gigahertz, which is the EBS-BRS spectrum. There's still white spaces that were going to be part of an FCC action. There are counties out there that don't have licensees or Sprint as an owner that will be available. Probably won't happen in 2019, but probably in 2020. So the third area that you have to look at, now that we've looked at kind of what they have on average, and then when you look at whether they can reach the entire US population, now we want to see how do they actually look in, and we're looking at the top 25 markets in the US for the 28 gigahertz licenses. And this is where I highlight T-Mobile's has these relatively light spectrum ownership in Los Angeles, in New York, Dallas, Philadelphia, but in a lot of the large markets. It's particularly a problem because the actual layout for it, each of those channels is 400 megahertz wide, and where T-Mobile owns is right in the middle of that. So they actually gave Verizon either gets 200 here and 100 here, and not even a contiguous like 275 block that might suggest. What Verizon's CTO recently came out to say is what the neighborhood trial in Houston is one 400 megahertz channel today, and it will be expanded to a second 400 megahertz channel. Now, if you were to look at this data, Ian, I'm not sure if Ian came back yet, Ian had his reasons, which, was foliage in Boston and New York. My reasons on why Verizon's not doing it in those markets is because they're really limited to, Washington, D.C., one 400 megahertz channel. They can't get to the second, or they're not even able to do a 400 megahertz channel. So that's the other thing that this kind of highlights. To look at 39 gigahertz, and then we'll look at the columns here for both Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. Definitely a very sad position for T-Mobile that they really only have spectrum in 2 markets. T-Mobile did do an acquisition in Ohio. They own almost all the 28 gigahertz spectrum in Ohio. But again, I think that ultimately that's positioning to work with Verizon to exchange spectrum assets. Looking at Verizon and AT&T, you can see not only do they each own spectrum in each of those top 25 markets, but it's also substantial. It's the lowest number we really see is 454, and for AT&T, it's typically 300 to 350 and above. So definitely, from their perspective, I can also reach the most urban markets immediately. The other thing to highlight with the 39 gig, and I was hoping to ask the AT&T contact, the 39 gigahertz spectrum is not in its final state. Today it's called paired spectrum, so you transmit on one part of the spectrum and from the phone, and you're going to transmit from the cell site on another piece of the spectrum. That is all has to get shifted around, and kind of all of AT&T's spectrum combined into one area. That's all going to be part of the next, after the 24 gigahertz auction, there'll be a 39 gigahertz auction. That all has to take place prior to that auction. So today, AT&T, I think, is limited to 50 or 100 megahertz for their fixed wireless broadband, but that will improve in the future, but I would question whether a lot of the assets, the network equipment, has to get changed once the band gets reconfigured. And then just a picture to kind of see for the 28 gigahertz license, so this is the active auction that's going on. You can see that the only markets that really are available, the largest one is the 55th largest market in the country, Honolulu, then Grand Rapids. So there really weren't any major metropolitan areas available in that auction for either of the 2 channels that are being auctioned. The 24 gigahertz auction, you can see that everything is in the FCC's control. So this is my final slide. Property tax implications. And I kind of put these bullet points together thinking of this from really a county basis, since I think that ultimately is a tax assessing base. But low band assets are going to be deployed, I think, to all markets, all counties, I think with the exception of the extremely rural areas that don't have 3G today. Mid-band assets are going to be deployed similar to what I call the old T-Mobile Sprint maps before T-Mobile started to deploy low-band spectrum, and that was major metro areas, so not city limits, but you had the entire Seattle, Tacoma, Everett area, you had the entire Dallas metroplex, and then strands along highways and interstates. I think that's the way you're going to see the mid-band spectrum assets deployed, and the millimeter wave assets, I believe, are really only going to be deployed in city limit type deployments. And to kind of use a personal example in my neighborhood, single family home neighborhood in Seattle, we have hills, we have evergreen trees. There are 5 street lights. So when we talk about small cells and talk about 900-foot radiuses, Verizon actually has a proposal to put a small cell in my neighborhood on one of those street lights. That light post is only going to cover fewer than 20 homes. And when you think about the fact that an alternate broadband provider is going to provide fiber there, you have Comcast in the neighborhood, and then you still have 3 other wireless providers that are going to compete for broadband to the home. It just doesn't seem like it's going to pencil out in the suburban environment to have the assets on a small cell and only be able to try to sell and get market share from 20 homes. When you go back to the city limits, at least like for Seattle, you immediately pull into that multi-story office buildings, apartment buildings, and you're getting a much larger population as a part of that deployment. So, any questions? And no questions are bad. Yes, Gary.
In capability between, say, 28 gigahertz and 39, they always talk of them together as though they have the same capability.
I haven't done the math on the propagation. There's just a clear formula that says if I have 600 megahertz spectrum, this is how much free space loss is. I haven't seen that. I haven't calculated that either. I used to be an RF engineer and I used to be able to do that, but there should be a performance difference. I'm not sure whether it's 50 feet or whether it's more substantial than that.
So you would think that the further up in gigahertz you go, the less the strength it would have.
Exactly, or the
forth, right?
Smaller distance that it will effectively work from a cell site. And the other thing I'd kind of open up, I don't know how much time I have left, but if you wanted to.
5 minutes per question.
Oh, okay. You can talk to me afterwards, but a short discussion at lunch that I worked at Clearwire, and some of the questions that were, or some of the highlights that Ian talked about that Verizon was experiencing with their fixed broadband deployment, almost identical to the same things that we dealt with, both from a sales, operations, RF coverage, authenticating who would be a valid user. So if you're interested in understanding more about fixed broadband and all the hair that's on it, I can definitely walk you through my experiences at Clearwire, because we had the book modem inside the window and dealt with the reflective nature of windows, and we dealt with I don't want it in my living room and all those types of things. But other questions on this, you can talk to me about that after the show.
Thank you very much, Brian, then.
Thank you.